From the Darkness Cometh the Light, or Struggles for Freedom, by Lucy Ann Delaney. Chapter 2. Mrs. Wash lost her health, and on the advice of a physician went to Pensacola, Florida, accompanied by my mother. There she died, and her body was brought back to St. Louis and there interred. After Mrs. Wash's death, the troubles of my parents and their children may be said to have really commenced. Though in direct opposition to the will of Major Berry, my father's quondam master and friend Judge Wash tore my father from his wife and children and sold him way down south. Slavery, cursed slavery! What crimes has it invoked? And oh, what retribution has a righteous God visited upon these traitors in human flesh? The rivers of tears shed by us helpless ones in captivity were turned to lakes of blood. How often have we cried in our anguish, "O Lord, how long, how long?" But the handwriting was on the wall, and tardy justice came at last and avenged the woes of an oppressed race. Chickamauga, Shiloh, Atlanta, and Gettysburg spoke in thunder tones. John Brown's body had indeed marched on, and we, the ransomed ones, glorify God and dedicate ourselves to his service and acknowledge his greatness and goodness in rescuing us from such bondage as parts husband from wife, the mother from her children, aye, even the babe from her breast. Major Berry's daughter Mary shortly after married H. S. Cox of Philadelphia, and they went to that city to pass their honeymoon, taking my sister Nancy with them as waiting maid. When my father was sold South, my mother registered a solemn vow that her children should not continue in slavery all their lives, and she never spared an opportunity to impress it upon us that we must get our freedom whenever the chance offered. So here was an unlooked-for avenue of escape which presented much that was favorable in carrying out her desire to see Nancy a free woman. Having been brought up in a free state, Mother had learned much to her advantage, which would have been impossible in a slave state, and which she now proposed to turn to account for the benefit of her daughter. So Mother instructed my sister not to return with Mr. and Mrs. Cox, but to run away as soon as chance offered, to Canada, where a friend of our mother's lived, who was also a runaway slave, living in freedom and happiness in Toronto. As the happy couple wandered from city to city in search of pleasure, my sister was constantly turning over in her mind various plans of escape. Fortune finally favored Nancy, for on their homeward trip they stopped at Niagara Falls for a few days. In her own words, I will describe her escape. In the morning, Mr. and Mrs. Cox went for a drive, telling me that I could have the day to do as I pleased. The shores of Canada had been tantalizing my longing gaze for some days, and I was bound to reach there long before my mistress returned. So I locked up Mrs. Cox's trunk and put the key under the pillow, where I was sure she would find it, and I made a strike for freedom. A servant in the hotel gave me all necessary information, and even assisted me in getting away. Some kind of a festival was going on, and a large crowd was marching from the rink to the river, headed by a band of music. In such a motley throng I was unnoticed, but was trembling with fear of being detected. It seemed an age before the ferryboat arrived, which at last appeared, enveloped in a gigantic wreath of black smoke. Hastily I embarked, and as the boat stole away into the misty twilight and among crushing fields of ice, though the air was chill and gloomy, I felt the warmth of freedom as I neared the Canada shore. I landed without question, and found my mother's friend with but little difficulty, who assisted me to get work and support myself. Not long afterwards I married a prosperous farmer who provided me with a happy home, where I brought my children into the world without the sin of slavery to strive against. On the return of Mrs. Cox to St. Louis, she sent for my mother and told her that Nancy had run away. Mother was very thankful, and in her heart arose a prayer of thanksgiving, but outwardly she pretended to be vexed and angry. Oh, the impenetrable mask of these poor black creatures! How much of joy, of sorrow, of misery and anguish have they hidden from their tormentors? I was a small girl at that time, but remembered how wildly Mother showed her joy at Nancy's escape when we were alone together. She would dance, clap her hands, and waving them above her head would indulge in one of those weird Negro melodies which so charm and fascinate the listener. Mrs. Cox commenced housekeeping on a grand and extended scale. Having a large acquaintance, she entertained lavishly. My mother cared for the laundry, and I, who was living with Mrs. Underhill from New York and was having rather good times, was compelled to go live with Mrs. Cox to mind the baby. My pathway was thorny enough, and though there may be no roses without thorns, I had thorns in plenty with no roses. I was beginning to plan for freedom and was forever on the alert for a chance to escape and join my sister. I was then 12 years old and often talked the matter over with Mother and canvassed the probabilities of both of us getting away. No schemes were too wild for us to consider. Mother was especially restless because she was a free woman up to the time of her being kidnapped, so the injustice and weight of slavery bore more heavily upon her than upon me. She did not dare to talk it over with anyone for fear that they would sell her further down the river, so I was her only confidant. Mother was always planning and getting ready to go, and while the fire was burning brightly, it but needed a little more provocation to add to the flames. End of section 2. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.